you are billed as an AOC backed candidate, and there's a lot of talk about your progressive politics. But what I'm hearing you say is that you are literally serving the community that is sending you to Congress. Why do you think people are using AOC or progressive as a kind of dig against you? And what's your response to that?
Yeah, I think we've been socially programmed to think of being a progressive as a negative thing or a white thing or a white middle class thing. And being progressive is all about just having your roots in the community and being connected to the needs of the people that matter most, which are, in my opinion, the most disenfranchised. And being progressive is the most American thing of all, right? The colonists fought back against the oppression of the British to start a revolutionary war and begin a country. The abolitionists pushed back against the slavery that was happening in this country, which ultimately led to the 13th Amendment and the freedom, the physical freedom of the enslaved. We had the civil rights movement. We had the women's movement. We had the LGBTQ movement. America is all about movements, applying pressure to elected officials to pass the policy that makes forward progress for our nation. So to be a progressive is the most American thing of all, especially when you look at, on the other side of that, our current capitalist system, which is toxic, which is oppressive, which allows three white men to own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country, and allows Jeff Bezos to grow his wealth in the tune of $50 billion when 120,000 people have died from COVID, disproportionately black and brown. So what we currently have is not working. So we need to do something else. And if that something else is so-called progressive, then so be it. I mean, we deserve, not just black people, but all people, health care is a human right. Housing is a human right. Fully funding our public schools, investing in jobs and environmental justice, criminal justice reform. I mean, these things are human rights that we've allowed the corporate interests and the wealthy elite to take over from the public sector. And now it's time for us to take it back.
You know, you said before that 50% of Congress is made up of millionaires, right? And I think that is meaningful. What is it that when you look at what you're going to do differently, very specifically, how are you thinking about closing that wealth gap so that people who live in your district get a better piece of that pie that so many congressional leaders have?
That's right. So one of the things we're hitting the ground running with is something called a Reconstruction agenda. And that Reconstruction agenda is focused on the issue of the legacy of slavery and racism and how it continues to permeate throughout every American institution. And part of the Reconstruction agenda is a Truth and Restoration Commission, similar to what happened in South Africa after apartheid and Rwanda after the genocide that took place there. America needs to reckon with its history, and we need a period of healing through truth and reconciliation. And part of that is the conversation about reparations. Part of that is the conversation of demilitarizing the police and lowering military spending and investing in areas of public health like housing, mental health supports, overall health care, education, and the like. And also reforming our tax code to ensure that the wealthy, large corporations, and Wall Street pay their fair share into the system so that we can reinvest in the people who have been historically disenfranchised throughout America's history. So that's a major part of it. There are some bills already that have been introduced by people in the House, like Ayanna Presley's People Justice Initiative, like AOC's Just Society bills, like Ilhan Omar's housing bill, which looks to invest $1 trillion over the next 10 years to build 12 million new social housing units, and Barbara Lee's focus on truth and reconciliation. It's all part of the conversation, and it's something that I'm going to include when I get to Congress as well.
And clearly they have the money because we just saw them print money during the stimulus for corporations and for So they clearly could just print the money.
It's a values issue, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
do we care? Do we have the values? Do we have the political will? And truth and reconciliation is a big part of this because it forces all of us to explore not just our unconscious racism and how that leads to decision making and policy, but our implicit bias as well. And because when you look at outcomes for African Americans in any American institution, we're at the bottom of the ladder. There's a reason for that, and that reason is rooted in the legacy of racism and the implicit bias that so many of us take into policy making in Washington and even at state and local levels as well. If you center if your values are driven by human rights, equality, and justice for all, then you're going to create the policy and infrastructure that will end police brutality as we know it. And we have to understand history, right? We have to understand that the first police in this country were slave patrols. And this is what we're talking about when we look at truth and reconciliation. That's the history. And that history is still manifesting to this day. So part of our Reconstruction agenda is not just about accountability and transparency. It's about reallocation of resources away from militarization and investing in public health, as I mentioned. But it's also about raising the standards for anyone that wants to be a police officer, so we don't bring in people who have this implicit bias and unconscious racism into law enforcement in the first place.